Mi nombre es Salvador García y busco a Cristabel García Esquivel.
Bueno, mi nombre es Marta Aria y busco a mis 3 sobrinos que me desaparecieron con mi hermana.
Mi nombre es Amparo Salinas y busco a Santos Ernesto Salinas.
Mi nombre es Milagro del Pilar Martínez y yo busco a mis 2 hijos desaparecidos que me quitaron en el momento del conflicto armado.
We could mention several effects of disappearances. However, we'll be centering in the quick explanation of what happens in 3 different levels in people's lives. First of all, in an individual level, the person has feelings of uncertainty, anguish, fear, hopelessness, among others. Indeed, they can't determine whether their loved one is dead or alive, and that takes completely the feeling of control of their own life away. That is why forced disappearance is considered as sustained torture for the relatives, for example. Then, in a family level, family dynamics are profoundly altered, spinning around the search of the disappeared, and sometimes with a significant load of guilt in some of the members. Some roles within the family are modified, and the everyday life is completely ruptured. Finally, in a social level, the relatives of the disappeared are often stigmatized and blamed for what happened to their loved one. This pushes them to retreat to the private sphere, losing a great deal of support networks. When this happens in a country like El Salvador, where official institutions don't offer the adequate support to the search and the care these relatives would need, the isolated efforts bring little response. Disappearance has sustained effects that encompass all areas of life. The pain for the relatives of the disappeared doesn't go away. Victims have lost the feeling of control of their own lives. By not having any answers about the whereabouts of their disappeared relative, by not knowing if they're dead or alive, not being able to get any answers, justice, or even support from the state. Their family and community relationships have been altered, and for most of them, their sole objective is to find their loved one. Taking into account this scenario, not to consider the needs of the victims in the search process would add to this uncertainty, injustice, and victimization. If their needs are considered and determined into the search process, they might regain some feeling of control, and the process itself could become restorative for them. In El Salvador, since the search of the disappeared was mostly led by victims' organizations, before the creation of 2 official search commissions, It was proven that the process should have the victims and their families' needs at its center. It has been also clear that as an organization, it's necessary to have a role of respectful accompaniment. In Pro-Búsqueda, for example, where we're able to find a life disappeared, we try to work with the expectation of both parts. It would be unethical and re-victimizing to force anything from any of them and not to take their needs into account. Disappearance is such a catastrophe in people's lives that our role and obligation is to make the best effort to minimize its effects by accompanying the families. This is only possible by taking needs into account and propitiate an empowerment in their own process.
Advocacy tools such as litigation, communications, and teaching can be useful to help the families of the victims of enforced disappearances in many, many ways. The first one is trying to give voice to people that is not heard enough in our societies, using our reach as a civil society organization in the country and in the global south. Other is through the use of public interest litigation to advance the interest of these families in local courts or domestic courts and in international forum, such as the Inter-American System of Human Rights.
The relationship between the search and criminal investigations concerning disappeared persons has been widely discussed and to a certain extent subjects of differences in interpretations. Since the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles for the Search for Disappeared Persons in April 2019, it has become clear that the search investigations have to be mutually interrelated and have to reinforce each other. Strong collaboration between everyone involved in the search on one side and everyone involved in investigations on the other. It's important because in many ways the search complements investigations and vice versa. As an example, witness testimony can be used as an evidence at criminal trial, but it can also serve to determine the fate and whereabouts of disappeared persons by finding a mass grave where the mortal remains lie. Having said all this, it is also important to be aware that investigation and the search are two obligations that exist independently from each other and that one doesn't preclude the other. Whenever the coordination of the search and investigation does not happen, this can result in a huge delay, but most importantly, it has a dramatic negative impact on the families or everyone else that is trying to pursue either the search or investigation or both.
When a loved one disappears, clarifying the fate and the whereabouts of the disappeared is essential for victims. Victims have a right to know, but it's argued also that they have a right to participate in the search process. They're important justice stakeholders, and their contribution is often crucial in carrying out effective search processes. Now, there is a big gap between the abstract and universal legal frameworks and practical implementations. And victims face many obstacles in the search process: psychosocial, structural, legal, political. Understanding how they experience these search processes and their encounters with different actors is essential. This is where a multidisciplinary perspective is important. I take the particular example of a social psychological theory, procedural justice theory, and how it helps to understand victims' experiences of the search process. It shows that the way in which processes are experienced affects victims' trust and agency. It posits that individuals will value their control over the process, irrespective of the outcome. And this is important for fairness perceptions. Now, for the case of enforced disappearances, this is particularly important because victims go through many stages of the search process, and many of them end up without any outcome or an incomplete one. And it's often not a judicial outcome that they have. So our findings here in our research show that two procedural justice concerns are often raised by victims. Those related to information, the quality and provision of it, and this is really important for victims of enforced disappearances. Now, the other one is the procedural concerns related to treatment, the quality of interactions with different actors, and whether they have felt that they have been treated respectfully. Not attending to these concerns constitutes another source of suffering and adds to the mistrust and feelings of powerlessness and distrust. Restoration of trust is really important for enforced disappearances. Relatives have little faith in public authorities to start with, and will often even distrust their own communities. Promoting their agency is also very important because they often come from disenfranchised communities, and suffer stigmatization due to their victimization. Thus, state and non-state actors who are involved in search processes need to give more attention to these procedural concerns beyond the outcome. This is why a multidisciplinary perspective here, I think, is really important.
The search for those who've been forcibly disappeared is incredibly important in terms of broader processes of peace building in societies following large-scale violations of human rights, where enforced disappearance has been used as an act of terror. Firstly, the search itself can be important in terms of building trust. So this might be between the population and the state, as particular institutions, the police, the military, the government, who may have been implicated in the disappearance itself, but also in the withholding of information important for the search. But we might also think of trust building between citizens, so within the population, in terms of immediate support for the search and in terms of giving up or coming forward with information that is possible, and therefore can be seen as strengthening those ties between an individual, the family that's searching, and their immediate community, friends and family, but also the society at large. Secondly, the search for process in terms of peace building is important in the truth-seeking element. So this is not only in terms of uncovering information about a specific disappearance and what happened and the whereabouts of that person, but also more broadly in terms of understanding the context in which the disappearance occurred. So who was involved, which actors remained silent, which actors did not, why, and what were the motivations, so the broader context which made the disappearance possible. But of course, there's no guarantee that the search itself will contribute to trust building or to truth seeking. Our research is really focused on the search as a process. So the way in which the aspects of procedural justice in terms of information gathering and truth seeking are experienced by the victims themselves as being accessible, as being fair, and as being transparent. And we see this as being just as important as the outcome of the individual search. And so it's important for those of us working on enforced disappearance as researchers, policymakers, or practitioners to bear in mind that the search process is experienced by victims and it will be experienced in different ways, and that it may well be unpredictable and non-linear. And we need to take this into consideration when writing about and supporting search processes.